For more than 75 years, NATO has stood as the cornerstone of Western security. It survived the Cold War, expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and remained united through conflicts in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and most recently, Ukraine. But today, the alliance faces a very different kind of challenge. This time, the pressure isn't coming from Moscow, it's coming from Washington. As NATO leaders gather for one of the most closely watched summits in recent years, President Donald Trump has renewed a demand that could fundamentally reshape the alliance. Europe must spend far more on its own defense. Supporters argue that this is long overdue. Critics warn that applying public pressure during a period of global instability risks weakening Allied unity. So the question is no longer whether NATO will change. The question is how far those changes will go and what they could mean for Europe's future security. In today's episode, we'll examine why defense spending has become NATO's most contentious issue, why this debate is intensifying now, and what it could mean for the balance of power across Europe and beyond. To understand why this debate has become so intense today, we first need to go back more than 7 decades. In 1949, Europe was still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War. Much of the continent had been destroyed, millions of lives had been lost, and a new geopolitical rivalry was already beginning to emerge. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe, while Western European nations feared that another conflict could erupt before they had fully rebuilt. In response, 12 countries came together to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. The alliance was built around one simple but powerful principle. An attack on one member would be treated as an attack on them all. This commitment, known as Article 5, became the foundation of NATO's collective defense. It was designed to discourage potential adversaries by making it clear that no member would have to stand alone. Over the decades, NATO continued to grow. More countries joined the alliance, military cooperation expanded, and despite the end of the Cold War, NATO remained one of the world's most influential security organizations. Throughout this period, however, one reality remained largely unchanged. The United States consistently provided the largest share of NATO's military capabilities. From advanced fighter aircraft and aircraft carriers to intelligence networks, missile defense systems, logistics, and nuclear deterrence, Washington invested far more resources than any other ally. For many European governments, this arrangement provided security, while allowing them to prioritize other domestic priorities such as healthcare, education, and social welfare. For decades, that balance remained largely intact. But as global security challenges evolved, so did the questions surrounding it. Should the United States continue carrying such a significant share of NATO's military burden? Or should Europe's wealthiest nations contribute much more to their own defense? These questions were being raised long before Donald Trump returned to the White House. Several American presidents, including both Republicans and Democrats, had urged European allies to increase their defense spending. The difference was never the message. The difference was how forcefully it was delivered. And today, that conversation has become impossible for NATO leaders to ignore. The world that NATO was built for no longer exists. The Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago. But instead of becoming more stable, the international landscape has grown increasingly unpredictable. Russia's invasion of Ukraine transformed European security almost overnight. For the first time in generations, many European governments began preparing for the possibility of a prolonged period of military confrontation on the continent. At the same time, the United States found itself balancing multiple strategic challenges. Washington continues to support Ukraine, while also increasing its focus on the Indo-Pacific, where China's growing military capabilities have become a central concern for American policymakers. Maintaining a strong military presence in both regions requires enormous financial resources, advanced equipment, and a defense industry capable of supporting multiple long-term commitments. Against this backdrop, President Donald Trump has once again argued that America's allies should assume a much greater share of the responsibility. His position is straightforward. If European nations possess some of the world's largest economies, they should also invest enough to defend their own continent. Supporters of this approach argue that stronger European militaries would create a more balanced alliance, reduce pressure on American taxpayers, and allow the United States to concentrate more of its resources on other strategic priorities. Critics, however, caution that public pressure and confrontational rhetoric can strain relationships within an alliance that depends on trust, coordination, and political unity. Despite those disagreements, one reality is becoming increasingly clear. The debate is no longer centered on whether Europe should spend more on defense. It is centered on how much more and how quickly. Many NATO members have already announced plans to expand their defense budgets, modernize their armed forces, and increase investment in military production. For alliance leaders gathering at this summit, the challenge is no longer convincing countries that defense spending matters. The challenge is determining whether those commitments can be translated into real military capabilities within the next several years. Because in today's security environment, promises alone are no longer enough. For years, many European governments acknowledged that defense spending needed to increase. The difficult part was turning those promises into reality. Building a stronger military is not something that can be accomplished in a matter of months. It requires years of planning, long-term investment, modern equipment, trained personnel, and an industrial base capable of producing everything from ammunition to advanced air defense systems. Since the war in Ukraine began, however, the conversation across Europe has changed dramatically. Countries that had once reduced military budgets after the Cold War are now announcing major investments in their armed forces. Several governments have committed to purchasing new fighter aircraft, expanding missile defense systems, increasing ammunition production, and strengthening their military readiness. Some NATO members have already reached the alliance's long-standing defense spending benchmark, while others are still working toward it. The pace of progress, however, has not been uniform. Every country faces different political priorities, economic pressures, and public expectations. For governments dealing with slower economic growth, rising public debt, or increasing social spending, allocating billions of additional dollars to defense is far from an easy political decision. Leaders must balance national security with healthcare, education, infrastructure, and other domestic priorities that directly affect voters. This is why the debate extends far beyond military strategy. It is also a question of economics. Every additional investment in defense requires difficult budget choices elsewhere. At the same time, supporters of higher military spending argue that a stronger European defense industry could create skilled jobs, stimulate technological innovation, and reduce the continent's dependence on foreign suppliers for critical military equipment. In many ways, Europe now finds itself at a strategic crossroads. One path continues the traditional model in which the United States remains the alliance's dominant military power. The other gradually shifts greater responsibility toward European nations themselves. The decisions being discussed today are therefore about much more than annual defense budgets. They will help determine how NATO operates, how military responsibilities are shared, and how Europe prepares for an increasingly uncertain security environment over the coming decades. The decisions made at a NATO summit don't stay within NATO. They are closely watched in capitals around the world. For Russia, every announcement about higher defense spending, new military deployments, or expanded weapons production is carefully analyzed. From Moscow's perspective, a stronger and better equipped NATO represents a long-term strategic challenge along its western borders. For NATO members, however, the argument is different. Alliance leaders say that strengthening military capabilities is intended to deter conflict rather than provoke it. The idea is simple. If potential adversaries believe NATO is prepared, united, and capable of responding to aggression, the likelihood of a direct confrontation may actually decrease. Whether that strategy succeeds is a matter of ongoing debate among military analysts and policymakers. Beyond Europe, another major factor is shaping Washington's strategic thinking. The United States is increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific, where competition with China has become one of its highest national security priorities. From advanced semiconductors and artificial intelligence to naval power and critical shipping routes, American policymakers now face the challenge of managing security interests across multiple regions at the same time. That is one reason many officials argue that Europe should become more capable of defending itself. If European allies assume a greater share of regional security responsibilities, the United States could gain more flexibility to concentrate resources elsewhere without weakening NATO as a whole. This shift reflects a broader transformation in global strategy. The international system is becoming increasingly multipolar, with several major powers shaping events simultaneously rather than a single dominant center of influence. In such an environment, alliances are no longer judged only by their size. They are judged by their readiness, their industrial capacity, and their ability to respond quickly to rapidly changing crises. That is why this summit is about more than defense budgets. It is part of a larger conversation about how military power, economic strength, and political influence will be distributed in the years ahead. And for allies as well as competitors, the outcome could shape strategic decisions far beyond Europe itself. History rarely changes overnight. More often, it shifts gradually through a series of decisions that only reveal their full significance years later. The debate taking place inside NATO today may prove to be one of those moments. Whether driven by growing security concerns, changing political priorities, or increasing economic pressures, the alliance is entering a period of transformation unlike any it has experienced since the end of the Cold War. For the United States, the objective is becoming increasingly clear. Successive American administrations have argued that Europe's security cannot depend indefinitely on Washington alone. President Donald Trump has expressed that message more directly than many of his predecessors, but the underlying debate extends well beyond a single administration. For Europe, the challenge is equally significant. Increasing defense spending is not simply about allocating larger budgets. It means expanding industrial capacity, training military personnel, strengthening supply chains, and maintaining long-term political support for investments that may take years to produce visible results. The choices made today could influence not only Europe's security, but also the future role of the United States within the alliance and the broader balance of power across the international system. Whether these changes ultimately strengthen NATO or create new political tensions will depend on how effectively member states translate commitments into lasting cooperation. One thing, however, is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The era in which NATO could rely on old assumptions appears to be coming to an end. As new challenges emerge across Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and beyond, the alliance is being asked to adapt to a world that is more competitive, more complex, and less predictable than at any point in recent decades. The decisions made during this period may not only define the future of NATO, they may also help shape the international security landscape for years to come. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing to WestGlobal News for in-depth coverage of global geopolitics, international security, and the economic forces shaping our world. I'm Chen, and I'll see you in the next episode.